Save the World. This is Tommy Vietor.
Ben Rhodes in Chicago.
Ben, what's going on in Chicago, man?
Just seeing some worldos, man. Talking to some college kids at the University of Chicago here on the South Side. Barack Obama's roots. So it's good to be back here.
Those kids are intimidatingly smart. Be careful.
They're wicked smart.
It's impressive.
I have to say. I did not get in here either.
No, I didn't even apply. This week, we're going to talk Iran. We're going to talk about which Fox News hosts are encouraging Trump to pardon people accused of committing war crimes. That is not a joke. A New York Times report on Bernie's foreign policy views in the 80s. This week in far-right politics in countries that start with A, and why milkshakes are the hottest new form of protest. Then, Palestinian-American human rights attorney Noura Erakat joins to talk about Trump's Middle East peace plan and what it will take to create a new Palestinian state. You ready, Ben?
I'm ready to roll.
All right, let's start with an Iran check-in. So, as all of our listeners know, you and I were quite worried about the risk of conflict with Iran. As recently as last week, my blood pressure went down a little bit when I started to read stories that seemed like maybe authorized leaks trying to ratchet down some of the tension. But then our rattle-smashing president tweeted, if Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again, which frankly echoed a tweet he sent that was basically the same a year ago. Today, the acting defense secretary said that the Iranian threats were, quote, on hold because of all the things the Trump administration has been doing. So, Ben, I guess my question is, how are you feeling at this point? Like, where's your anxiety meter when it comes to Iran?
Well, the anxiety meter is down a little bit. And I want to make a point that I think is important for people listening. It kind of reminds me a little bit of healthcare in the sense that they're trying to do something. They're trying to push an ideological agenda. And then people made a bunch of noise, and there's a recognition of how unpopular this was. And in that case, you had Congress, and so you had McCain who could cast a vote against it. What kind of felt like was happening the last few weeks, and you and I have been calling this out, is this kind of sleepwalking into a war with Iran, Mm-hmm. And we don't have to relive it, but basically they're deploying military assets, they're referring to vague intelligence, they're issuing threats, and it felt like they were setting the stage to provoke the Iranians into doing something or to claiming a pretext for them to take some action. And, people started to make a lot of noise. And some people in Congress started to make noise, some people in the press, hopefully some people out there listening to the show. And then you have Trump come out and say, well, wait a second, I don't want to go to war with Iran, because they know that a war with Iran is unpopular. I think it's really important for people to keep saying, don't do this. This would be a disaster. People don't want you to do this. Trump, you said you're going to keep us out of these wars. I think there's a need to remain vigilant, because they did respond, and they've tried to walk it back. Because I think they looked over the precipice of this thing, and Bolton was driving the bus, and then they decided, looks like, maybe we should put the brakes on. As you said, Trump is still, one day he's saying he wants peace, and the next day he's saying he could destroy the entire country. Mm-hmm. So I think people need to remain vigilant here. The risk of an escalation is still high, but it does feel like it's worth people making a lot of noise about this and about how this is not something that people would support, because I think Trump seems to respond to that.
I agree with you there. One thing I want to ask your gut check on, there was a report that Oman's foreign minister visited Tehran and that Pompeo had reached out to the Omanis. They've historically played a helpful go-between role for the U.S. and the Iranians. Did that make your blood pressure go down at all?
Well, it went down and went up. It went down because, yes, the Omanis are among all the Gulf states, who are all majority Sunni states. The Omanis have maintained good relations with the Iranians, and they have lines directly into the supreme leader. And so when we were in government, they hosted the secret negotiations that led to what became the Iran deal. And so they would be the natural middleman to open up a channel of communication between the U.S. and Iran, which I think there needs to be. I also noticed Trump saying, well, we don't want to go to war. We just want Iran to agree to limit its nuclear program. And I'm thinking, well, we have this thing that we negotiated called the Iran deal with the Omanis, and it seems like they're kind of going back to the beginning of that process. But, given the choice between that and a war, I'll take it. I still think people have to be vigilant, because the context that the administration set, and even what Trump said about threats, is they could take any event in that region and use it as a pretext.
Yeah.
Or the Saudis could say, oh, the Iranians, as they attacked one of our vessels, and then they're calling Trump and saying you have to hit back against the Iranians. So we got a year and a half left of the first term of the Trump administration. The possibility that pretext could emerge is still there. Better for them to be, again, warned off of war and hopefully to at least try to establish some channel of communications. I'd rather have a very weird North Korea-like diplomatic process with the Iranians than a war. So if the Iranians can execute that, that would be good. And they would be the party that can do that, because neither Saudi Arabia or the UAE or these other Gulf states have the same relationships in Iran that Oman has. That's why we use them. Presumably that's why they're emerging now in the middle of this picture.
Yeah, amen to that. There was also a big New York Times piece by David Sanger where he walked through the fact that the goal the administration seems to be articulating for what an Iran deal 2.0 could be was basically the exact same thing, the exact same time frame that Obama negotiated, but, whatever. Another data point, on the roller coaster of our blood pressure. So the AP reported that Iran has quadrupled its uranium enrichment production capacity. They said they'll stay under the 3.67% enrichment limit set by the nuclear deal, but it's likely that their stockpile of enriched uranium will go beyond what's allowed. Ben, none of that sounded like English to anyone listening. Can you tell us in layman's terms if that's a big deal?
Yeah, so I think there's ways to think about this. The Iran deal had different pieces to it. So in one piece, the Iranians rolled back their program. So they took out 2/3 of their centrifuges. They essentially filled the core of the reactor that could build plutonium with concrete, so it can't do that. Those are the steps that they took to set back their nuclear program. Then they secondly agreed to a series of steps that limited their stockpile so that they just had less raw materials to deal with in the country if they chose to restart their program. And then thirdly, they agreed to a bunch of inspections, very intrusive inspections, to monitor their nuclear program so we could see what was going on there. We could make sure they were keeping their commitments. What I read is that the Iranians, in response to Trump pulling out of the deal and re-sanctioning them for a year, essentially announced that they're going to begin to plus up the materials they have, the stockpile they have. That suggests to me it's not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is they kick out the inspectors, they start installing centrifuges, and they're in a situation where they're dashing off to build a weapon. It feels to me like they wanted to do something to show that there were consequences for Trump violating the Iran deal, and they maybe wanted to create some conditions where if they chose to restart the program, they might be starting from a slightly higher base. And so it's a testing by the Iranians of how far they want to push here. It's not, again, the worst steps that they could take. It's not them kicking out inspectors. It's not them installing all their centrifuges. It's them trying to send a political message, not unlike North Korea testing weapons, that we're frustrated that you guys have violated this deal. We're going to push the envelope too. We're going to put ourselves in a position to have some more materials here so that if this thing all falls apart, we're starting from that position instead of from the position of all the restrictions of the Iran deal.
Right.
The Trump people say they want to negotiate something better. The reality is there's not that many different formulations here. We had a deal that shipped out 98% of their materials, that rolled back, eliminated the ability for them to produce plutonium, that rolled back the number of centrifuges that they had so they couldn't produce a weapon within a year if they chose to break the deal and try to get all the material for a weapon. And that's what the Trump people are now talking about doing. And they could try to bring in some other elements like Iran's ballistic missiles. But at its core, any nuclear deal with Iran is going to look somewhat like our deal, And the question is, do you want a deal like that in place or not? And I think the Trump people are presented with what we always said would be the choice, which is either you have a deal like that in place or it goes away, and you're left with this question of whether you go to war with the Iranians to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. That ultimately is the decision space, and I hope that they choose the course of trying to return to some diplomacy here.
Yeah, me too. Let's go to a little bit more disturbing story. So President Trump is reportedly hoping to celebrate Memorial Day by pardoning members of the military accused of war crimes. I guess this is a idea that Fox News host Pete Hegseth is pitching to him. One case is a Navy SEAL who was turned into the authorities by his own guys in his unit for killing civilians, including children and a teenage hostage. The others are members of Blackwater, a private militia force. They killed dozens of unarmed Iraqis in 2007. There are some Marine Corps snipers charged with urinating on dead Taliban fighters. Ben, we were lucky to work with and around a lot of unbelievable U.S. service members from literally every branch of service. I mean, Can you imagine the men and women we worked with wanting to celebrate Memorial Day by associating their service with war crimes?
No, I mean it's hugely offensive to the vast majority of U.S. service members who conduct themselves with remarkable professionalism in incredibly difficult circumstances. Look, people should read these stories. I mean, this one guy, this one Navy SEAL, was literally just decided to shoot a child and kill that child. You know, decided to execute a prisoner. Right? Freaked out his fellow service members such that they reported him, which is a drastic act within the kind of brotherhood of the Navy SEAls.
Yeah, and he was their boss.
And so, and number one, so it sends a message to everybody else that these guys are heroes. The guys who broke the rules, and the people that blew the whistle on them are the bad guys. That's sick. That's disgusting. It has messages beyond the United States. We have been at the center of trying to have there be rules that govern how people fight wars. A lot of these rules date back to World War I and World War II when you had the mass slaughter of innocents and people deciding we don't want to do that anymore. We have Geneva Conventions. We have protections for people who are prisoners of war. We don't just randomly shoot civilians. That saves untold lives around the world, the fact that you have the United States and other countries invested in those rules. And the United States pulls out of that. Not only does that put civilians in danger, it puts our service members in danger. What happens if they're caught in a conflict? We count on those rules to protect our service members. So it's ultimately potentially putting them in danger. And for what? Because culturally, like Donald Trump and some fucking Fox News host who I've never heard of until you just said his name, think it's good politics to say, well, what's wrong with the guy? He's a SEAL, and so what? He killed a child. How can you defend this? This is indefensible.
It's indefensible.
And this is not how the commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful military should be acting, to take our kind of culture war, Fox News bullshit, political grievances and give life to them this way. It sends a dangerous message. It will put civilians at risk around the world and ultimately put our troops at risk.
Yeah, and that case, that individual murdering a child or a hostage, it's I'm sure everyone hears that and thinks that's a no-brainer. That person should go to jail. People might listen to this and think, okay, so some Marine Corps snipers urinated on dead Taliban fighters. Isn't that a lesser case? But I can think of so many meetings that you and I were in when there was some really ugly incident, like desecrating a corpse or a Quran was desecrated that led to protests or riots that could last weeks or months that were clearly and obviously insulting to people in the region, and that's a separate set of issues. But again, to your point that we could put our own service members serving abroad at risk, these instances led to massive instability and people were killed. I mean, it's a big deal to send a message that we don't care about protecting the corpse of an Afghan soldier.
Yeah, you remember how much this mattered to Petraeus, right?
Yes.
I mean, remember that crazy guy, Terry Jones, the guy who would burn Qurans? And Petraeus, when he was commander in Afghanistan, would be the most upset about these things because he said there would always be a spike in Taliban attacks against his guys when some nutcase would burn a Quran on YouTube or something. I mean, so this is not just a bunch of lefties talking about this stuff. Our generals were constantly blowing the alarm bells that, if you are desecrating the Quran, urinating on corpses, that is the lifeblood, the propaganda that people use to motivate others to come attack our people.
Yeah, that's a really ugly one and a no-brainer. So let's turn to some reporting on Bernie Sanders' foreign policy record. The Times did a feature on Bernie and a follow-up interview with him about his foreign policy record as the mayor of Burlington. He visited Nicaragua in the mid-'80s. He strongly opposed Reagan's anti-communist policy agenda generally. He formalized a sister city relationship between Burlington and Yaroslavl, which I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a city in the Soviet Union. He went to Cuba. It's very interesting that he dug into these issues as a mayor. Ben, I was curious what you made of this story, both the fact that he was just so active on foreign policy, but also the policies themselves, like opposing the right-wing militias we were supporting in the region, for example.
Yeah, I mean, look, I thought this whole episode was kind of interesting because, first of all, it's a reminder that in the 80s, there were these contested issues. And if you were on the left, like Bernie, you were raising all these concerns about the U.S. support for the Contras and the death squads and right-wing militias in Central America. I personally, like, probably wouldn't have gone as far as like a sister city in the Soviet Union, but, Bernie was doing his own form of detente out of Burlington. What I think is revealing, though, is that Bernie's getting all this shit for this as if it was wrong to oppose the Reagan administration's Central America policies. And this is relevant today because the guy who was the engineer of those policies, Elliot Abrams, is in charge of the regime change policy in Venezuela right now, right? And it's interesting to me that it's more seemingly outside of the mainstream that Bernie took these views than for what Elliot Abrams did. I mean, it's one of these things that holds a mirror up to how American journalists and American politics look at foreign policy, that it's somehow a problem for Bernie that, he was opposing actively U.S. Central America policy in the 1980s, whereas it's not necessarily as big a problem for the guy who was the architect of a policy that killed innocent civilians, that supported death squads, who's now serving in a high-ranking position in the Trump administration. I mean, whether or not you would go as far as Bernie did in the 80s, he was reflecting, I think, some pretty valid critiques about how far the Reagan administration was going, particularly in Central America. And, I think Bernie deserves credit for being himself and not walking those back.
Yeah, it was interesting because the Times posted their investigative story, and then Bernie did an interview. And you could tell in reading the interview that the story pissed him off a bit, especially questions about an event he attended in Nicaragua, or I guess there were anti-American chants or sentiment. And it's interesting because the frame of the question is basically, I don't know, the subtext is, would this sound bad if used against you in a political ad? Would this look bad on Fox News? And Bernie's trying to make the case like, oh, well, of course there was anti-American sentiment in a country where we were supporting one side of a civil war, right? But I don't know. It was hard for me to read that question and not feel his pain, feel Bernie's frustration in the way it was framed to him, but then also wonder to myself, what would Fox News do with this story if he were the nominee? Yeah,
I mean, I think, look, and to be clear, like, some of these guys, like Danny Ortega, the guy down there that Bernie supported, he wasn't a great guy either. But at the same time, I think, first of all, Bernie's not someone who spent his whole life thinking he'd run for president, right? And you know what? Like, he's the mayor of Burlington. He's on the left. He opposes our Central America policies with some very good reason. He goes down there. He's not someone who's sitting there in the 80s thinking, like, if there's some videotape of me at a rally where people are saying anti-American things, how will that look in, 30 or 40 years when I'm running for president? And I kind of think it's dumb to hold people to a standard that if, like, there's anything in it's like Reverend Wright, like,
yes, exactly.
Obama, when he went to church on the South Side, wasn't thinking, like, well, how will this video of my pastor sound, my presidential campaign? Some of that is just out of your control. I do think that Bernie, it's right to push back and say, wait a second, why is this question coming at me about the optics of what I did and not about the position I was taking, which is, again, why is it more controversial to oppose the U.S. support for Contras and death squads in Central America than it was to support that? There's something weird about the political incentives around foreign policy that always favor the kind of more hawkish, aggressive, interventionist position, and Bernie's trying to blow the whistle on that. I do think, to be fair to the Times, like, this is going to be out there. Bernie's going to have to explain it like anything else in a presidential campaign. And, Bernie's getting scrutiny that he might not have gotten last time because he seems like a front runner. And so that's part of life. And you might not like it, but it's going to be there. I think the goal for him should be to just kind of make his case for why he believed what he did believe then. And you, as you and I know, we can complain about the media till the end of time, but it's going to be there. So take it head on, address it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also, I think, an open question if people really care about things from the mid-'80s or '90s when we have a president of the United States currently who is a massive scumbag for all of those decades, and no one seemed to care because we elected him.
And it should be pointed out that you have a president of the United States who said, like, oh, well, we've had some killers, too, in the United States. And it's not like Trump has never said anything bad about American foreign policy. He said, frankly, probably a lot worse things than Bernie Sanders in the last several years about American foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, he knows more about ISIS and the generals, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, let's talk about a section we're calling This Week in Far-Right Politics in Countries That Start with A. First, Australia. Their conservative coalition won a surprise victory in last week's general election. It's hard to spin this one. It sucks. It's a huge blow to those who want action on climate change. Ben, any brief thoughts on this bummer?
It's a bummer because it looked like the right was going to be dislodged there. My one brief thought is like, hey, message to worldos in Canada. You know, you don't want to wake up after your election and have some far-right guy who's against action on climate in there either. Hopefully it galvanizes progressives in the next big election in Canada to say we don't want to end up there.
Yeah, agreed. That's a very good point. Okay, the next one is Austria. Okay, so this is a truly wild story. Austria called for snap elections after the far-right vice chancellor resigned. So this guy, Heinz Christian Strache, I think is his name, of the right-wing populist party, Freedom Party of Austria, was caught in a sting operation where he was filmed eating, drinking, and hanging out in a villa in Ibiza with a woman who claimed to be the niece of a Russian oligarch, as one does. She said she wanted to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy a major Austrian newspaper and use it to help the Freedom Party, the right-wing party, win. In exchange, she wanted big government contracts. So I guess my first question on this one is kind of meta, Ben. It's like, this was an amazing, elaborate sting. We don't know who did it. The newspapers who published the stories do. But like, these guys rented a villa. They wired it with cameras and microphones. Like, who has this capability? Is this a foreign intelligence service?
I don't know. I don't think it has to be. I mean, because, like, first of all, kudos, like, just exposes what everybody knows, right? That, A, these people are corrupt. B, they're full of shit when they say they're working for you and not looking out for themselves. And 3, they're more than happy to jump in bed with the Russians, right? And, you know, swap out Austria for United States, Hungary, any other number of countries.
Right. These
people are exposing what everybody suspected about this crowd of, you know, right-wing neo-fascists who are popping up all over the world. And the reality is, you know, anybody with a checkbook can rent a villa and set up this kind of thing. Frankly, the trolling has usually come at us from the right. This is some pretty damn effective trolling from somebody coming from another direction. And look, the reality is it exposes who we already know these people to be. You know, I mean, part of the reason why it's even more damaging is it kind of sends the message that all these kind of far-right people in Europe are more than happy to be corrupt, more than happy to try to control the media, again, more than happy to accept help from the Russians. And so hopefully this ripples out, not just in Austrian politics, where hopefully there's a chance to get rid of a far-right government in Austria, not a place where you want a far-right government, no. But also a chance for progressives to say, look, this is who this crowd is, and let's throw them out everywhere.
Yeah, and, you know, going back to our episode last week and the week before, I mean, these guys were looking at Viktor Orban and what he's done as the model. They wanted to build a media landscape similar to his. The timing of the publication, it was Der Spiegel and Süddeutsche Zeitung. I can't pronounce that. I'm sorry. My parents are German too. This published right as these far-right populist parties are campaigning for seats in the European Parliament and look likely to do well. So I don't know, maybe it was timed for some maximum political impact in a way we might like for once.
No question it was. And you're right, by the way, to point to Orban, you know, because his whole thing was get some oligarchs on the business side who can fund my campaigns, get some oligarchs in the media who can be my mouthpiece. Hate to break it to us Americans out there, you know, look at the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch. We have those oligarchs here in the United States. We just don't call them oligarchs.
Right.
But, yeah, this is European parliamentary election. It's hugely contested. There's been a concern for a long time that if the far right does particularly well and gets enough seats in the European Parliament, they can kind of grind the European Union to a halt, you know, and they can make it even more dysfunctional and divisive, and that will fuel the anti-European sentiment in different countries. And that's why what is usually kind of a second-tier election is getting so much attention. And clearly, you know, Trump was trying to affect that, as we talked about last week, by, you know, inviting his neo-fascist buddy into the White House, Viktor Orban. But whoever did this is trying to blow the whistle and say, no, look at who these people really are. Look at what the far right really represents in Europe. We don't want that here. And clearly, I think it was time to have impact on those elections. And it'll be fascinating to see how those elections play out. But, you know, it'll also have impacts in Austria and potentially ripple out. And look, I think as a general matter, you know, it's a slippery slope, you know, to end up in a situation where everybody's running sting operations against everybody else. The core question, though, is what are people doing? Because, frankly, if the surest way to make sure that you're not caught trying to accept help from some woman Russian oligarch seeking to buy friendly media is to not do that.
Yes, yes.
So that's the core question in play here.
Yeah, don't go to Ibiza and spend 6 hours negotiating with an oligarch. All right, last topic for us. Britain's hottest new protest movement is dousing people with milkshakes. Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage, certified asshole, was doused with banana and salted caramel. Earlier this month, a man threw a strawberry milkshake on Tommy Robinson. He's an anti-Muslim activist running for European Parliament seats, a seat. There are a bunch more examples, so many that police are actually trying to prevent the sale of milkshakes near political rallies. We also probably remember Egg Boy in Australia, who hit a far-right candidate in the head with an egg. So, Ben, at the risk of reawakening a tired debate about civility politics, I'm curious what you think about this form of protest. I mean, I worry personally about anything that could be even on the border of violent or threatening or a physical act. But, I think there are probably others who disagree. What's your take?
Well, first of all, I'm just glad that best British friend of the pod, David Lammy, has obviously escaped the milkshake treatment as he deserves to. Obviously, people are feeling incredibly pent-up frustration at the Brexiteers and the Nigel Farages of the world peddling a bunch of bullshit and are seeking to embarrass them, humiliate them, get attention. I tend to come down where you are, that if anything could injure somebody, right? And presumably a milkshake could be thrown in a way that could injure somebody, that is the line that I don't cross. Maybe you could just dump the milkshake in front of somebody. I don't know. But to me, if it gets to a point where somebody can be physically harmed, right, that's the kind of speech that I start to get uncomfortable with.
Yeah, me too.
I do think if there are other ways to just point up what full of shit buffoons these guys are, that is a generally useful exercise. I think there are other ways to do that. There are other ways to challenge Nigel Farage. There are other ways to probably even to use milkshakes without directly hitting somebody. And look, I think part of what we're seeing in the world, Tommy, is it's interesting to watch play out. And we've talked about a couple examples. The right wing kind of took trolling to a pretty aggressive extent, particularly on social media. Mm-hmm. But also, I was investigated by Black Cube. We talked about this on the pod. And I think you're seeing just this kind of frustration and version of trolling and response, and ultimately that's not the story that's going to win, right? But I do think it shows you that, these tactics end up taking different forms in the hands of different people. And what I'd like to see is that people who are feeling that frustration, there are plenty of places you can channel that energy to beat these people where it actually matters, which is at the ballot box, right? And which is getting engaged and getting active and being outspoken in your community, running for office, challenging people on social media, batting back false narratives, putting forward your story. That ultimately is going to be how people win in this competition of stories that's taking place around the world. But, every now and then somebody wants to have fun. As long as nobody gets hurt, that's my test.
Yeah, I won't pretend I didn't laugh at Nigel Farage yelling at his security guards because he was mad that it happened, but I do worry. You throw something, then a security guard could beat you up or someone around you. I mean, things can go south in a hurry. And also, it's just likely that the bigger fascist in the argument is going to go further when it comes to violence. So it's just something we need to be mindful of.
Yeah, we had a good buddy, Mark Lippert, right, who's our ambassador in Seoul. And he was speaking at some event, and some dude ran up to him after and caught him with a knife and hurt him pretty bad.
Yeah, cut his face.
And I'm not saying that the people with milkshakes are doing that, but I'm saying is once you start invading the personal space of these people, then maybe one guy sees the milkshake and thinks, well, I'm going to hit him, and then the next guy says, I'm going to cut him, right? And so it's just it's a dangerous place to go. I will say that the Nigel Farages of the world sit in the biggest fucking glass houses on earth, right? Because their rhetoric is downright incitement to violence against Muslims, against immigrants, right? Mm-hmm. And then they get a little milkshake on their suit and get all bent out of shape. I mean, if we're really talking about protecting people, that should also be people rejecting the kind of hate speech that emanates from the Nigel Farages of the world as well. Because in the long run, that probably has led to much more harm being done to people. There were, as in the United States, where you saw the rise in Islamophobia and hate crimes in the recent years. After Brexit, there are a lot of reports, I think, of foreigners being harassed, and you can draw a straight fucking line from some thugs on the London Underground messing with some immigrant to the kind of garbage that comes out of Nigel Farage's mouth.
Yeah, agreed with that. Well, that's all I had, man. Anything else from your end?
No, man, I'm good. I'm on this never-ending book tour, and I have to say that I've gotten more feedback on my Queen story than I think anything I've said aloud in years. So I'm glad people out there liked it. Well, we have more material to mine in the weeks and pods to come here.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the best stories. I can't believe you didn't put it in the book. You would have sold another,
kind of stupid, right? Yeah, it just shows you
copies.
what I don't know.
Great talking to you. Please send my love to Chicago. And now we will throw it to my interview with Noura Erakat.